Hello, in this video I'll walk through the different permutations of barrier options, and at the end I'll show you the key relationship that we want to understand for the valuation of the barrier options. And we can have either knockout barrier or knock-in barrier, and if the current asset price is below the barrier, then we can either have a up and out or an up and in. And if the stock price is above the barrier, we can either have a down and out or a down and in. So the key feature of the barrier option, of course, is the barrier. And that means in addition to our usual variables of initial stock price and strike price, that we need to have a barrier. I'm following John Hull, so I denote the barrier with an H, and in this case the barrier happens to be $95. And the barrier option can either be a knockout or a knock-in. For the knockout picture, I've got a boxing glove here, and for the knock-in, I've got a tree, because we sometimes say that the barrier option comes alive or is activated or comes into existence. So in the case of a knockout option, the stock price, let's just say it starts above our barrier, then as long as the stock price stays above the barrier, the barrier option stays in existence like a usual option and does not get knocked out. But if the stock price drops below the barrier, then the barrier option gets knocked out. It ceases to exist. We hold nothing at expiration. In the case of a knock-in, again, I'll just assume that the initial stock or asset price is above the barrier. In the case of a knock-in, when we start the barrier option, we don't hold anything. So if the stock price, let's just say, stays range bound to expiration, it never gets knocked in and we don't hold an option at maturity or expiration. In the case of a knock-in, what we want to happen is for the stock price to drop below the barrier in this case, and then the option comes into existence or gets activated. So that implies some permutations, and each with value implications. I've used some colors here to try and make this a little more intuitive. And so here I've got a knockout, and all of my examples assume that the initial stock price is $100, so it really should be S sub 0. And also, in this first example, I've got the strike price at $90. So you'll notice that if this were just a vanilla or standard call option, I'm going to be using call options throughout, we would initially have intrinsic value of $10. So this would be an in-the-money call option. That would be in terms of a vanilla or standard option. And then I'm just adding here a barrier that happens to be above the strike, but below the current asset price, right? So if it's a knockout, that's why I've colored this green, because in a knockout, we start by holding the option. And if our barrier here is below the stock price, then, and it's a knockout, then this is a down and out call, right? Because the stock price would need to fall down to the barrier and then it gets knocked out. So the down and out call is a version here of the knockout. And so that means that if this stock price, let's just say, remains range bound, this is sort of just my stylistic timeline, and we get to the end here, then, and the stock price, if it never falls below the barrier, it never gets knocked out, and we, at the end, we hold a call option just as if we had purchased a vanilla or standard European call option at the beginning. It never got knocked out, and our strike price here is fixed at $90, just like a standard or vanilla call option. On the other hand, with this knockout option, we are paying less to incur the risk that the stock price falls below the barrier here, and maybe you can start to imagine or understand why the measurement frequency is a relevant variable here. The more often or more frequently we measure this, the more the increased probability that we'll get knocked out. So in this case, with the down and out call, if the stock price falls below the 95, then this gets knocked out, and when we get to expiration, we hold nothing. Okay, so that's the down and out call. And then now this is still a down and out call. The only difference here is I've moved the barrier below that same strike price of $90. This actually does make a difference on the valuation, and the valuation is in the spreadsheet, which you can download. And so in this case with the down and out call, you'll notice if the stock price moves below here, the strike price, we're going to be underwater. So maybe we don't care, maybe we're not greatly invested in whether the stock goes further and then this option gets knocked out. You may wonder, what's the difference? Well, the stock price could recover. So there is still some value in this down and out call where the barrier is below the strike. Okay, so that's the knockout. And now I show you knock in, where again, stock price at 100, barrier is below the stock price. And so now, because it's a knock in, it's the down and in call, right? As opposed to a down and out, because the stock price needs to go down, hit the barrier, and then it gets activated or comes into existence. And in this case, the barrier is above the strike price. So initially, we don't really hold anything. It hasn't been activated. So if this stock remained trade bound or range bound in the case of this down and in call and never breached the barrier, then at maturity, we hold nothing. We do not have an option. What we require for any value here in the down and in call is we need the stock price to fall below the barrier, down and in. Then, having done so, again, measurement frequency being relevant, then this down and in call is activated, or as Hull says, comes into existence. And you can see here there's a little bit of cushion where it can come into existence with positive intrinsic value, although of course we're hoping that it falls below the barrier, comes into existence, and then just increases for more intrinsic value. In that case, the option has been activated. It doesn't go back. It's just one way. It steps through the door of activation and will hold the call option at maturity, just as if we had purchased a vanilla call option with a strike of 90 at the beginning. And here, all I've done with the down and in call is move the barrier below the strike price. So this option also has positive value. Although you can see how, if you just imagine purchasing this, you don't want to pay too much for this down and in call, do you, when the barrier is below the strike, because we hold nothing here until the stock price drops below 90. Well, that's not even enough. And that's going to be where we have zero intrinsic value. So in this down and in call, the stock price needs to drop below to 85 to get activated, at which point we'll be $5 underwater, won't matter anyway, and then we require the stock to go back above the strike price. So you can imagine here in this sort of down and in call where the barrier is below the strike, probably don't want to pay too much for this. And then now I switch to scenarios where the barrier is or the strike price, K, is above the stock price. So these are all just call options. I'm just doing call options, keep the video brief. Of course, there's corresponding set of put options for all of these, right? The barrier option not limited to call options. We can't have put options. But in this case, we're initially out of the money in terms of our comparison to a vanilla or standard call option. And here we have a barrier that's set above the strike price. And in the case of the knockout, then we would call this an up and out call, because the stock price needs to move up to the barrier and then get knocked out, up and out. And if that barrier here in this case reaches 115, then it gets knocked out and it ceases to exist at maturity. And you can see here how you probably wouldn't pay a whole lot for this option either, right? Because the strike price here is 110. We need the stock to go to 110 to get intrinsic value anyway. And now, whereas a European call, this would all be additional intrinsic value or gravy for us. The problem is it will get knocked out. So this option is not worth a whole lot either. And here I have a knockout, but the barrier is set below K. So this one is interesting. Would ask yourself, would you pay anything for this option? The stock price is 100. We need it to get to 110 in order to have intrinsic value. However, it gets knocked out at 105 when the barrier is below the strike price. If you wouldn't pay anything for this option, you would be correct. The value of this option, this barrier option, happens to be 0 because by definition, it gets knocked out before there's any intrinsic value. So this is the one case here where the value is 0. And then I think the final set of permutations here, my knock-in is my up and in call where stock price is 100 and the strike price is 110 and my barrier is above the strike price. So here we hold nothing if the stock remains trade bound, range bound, and what we need is for the stock price to increase above the 115 barrier, at which point it will already, when it gets activated, have at least $5 of intrinsic value. So this option does have value and is a little bit less value in comparison to its vanilla analog because we require an additional movement on the stock price to get any activation or for this option to come into existence. And we can also set the barrier below this strike price. And this option would also have value to us, right? It does not come into existence if we remain trade bound, range bound. However, if it goes up to 105, then the option gets activated. And when it does get activated, it's still going to be out of the money. And so, but we will hold an option with a strike price of 110. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, I will show some valuation scenarios here. And there's one key idea that informs the valuation here that we want to understand at the superficial level. Here I have a down scenario in the sense that my stock price, again, as usual, is 100, and my strike price is set below. And so if we think about just buying a European call option, we would be in the money. It would have intrinsic value of $10. If I price just the European call option, notice that just denoted simple C, small c for European, with some assumptions here, volatility 30%, risk-free rate of 40%, and I'm using a 1-year option. If I just purchased this European call option that is $10 in the money, the price of it is $19.50. That's because it's got quite a bit of maturity, 1 year, and you can see it has $10 of intrinsic value and therefore $9.15 of time value. Now, if I just compare that to purchasing the portfolio here of a down and out call with barrier of 95 and a down and in call with the same barrier of 95, just imagine a portfolio of both of those barrier options together. What I have is I have the same exact payoff profile that I have in this European call option. That is to say, my stock price, if it remains range bound here, then my down and out doesn't get knocked out, and so I end up with a call option that has a strike of $90, and my down and in barrier option never comes into existence, so I end up with one option. On the other hand, if I do breach the barrier, then my down and out gets knocked in, but my down and in barrier option comes into existence, and similarly, I'm going to hold an option with a strike of $90. So my point to you is that if I have a portfolio of the down and out plus the down and in, where the same barrier, that either way, I'm going to end up in the same exact situation at maturity as if I just bought a standard or vanilla European option with strike of 90 at the beginning. And so by definition, the value of the down and in and the down and out with the same barrier, of course, needs to equal the value of the vanilla European call. And that my valuation model reflects that. In this case, the down and in option here, I'm just going to do the down and in has an option of value of 1260, and the down and out has a value of 655. Each of them, but you can see here, the advantage of incurring the risk of the barrier is that each of them is significantly less in terms of price than the European call. And so I just have 3 more of these scenarios just to show the equality. Here I've got the barrier below the $90 strike, and this European call is 915. And just to show you, remember that's the same. The value of my European call of 1915 is unchanged for that strike price of $90. And here, similarly, the sum of the price of my down and in and my down and out must equal the same 1915. So here, my down and out with barrier of $85, it costs me $15.09, still almost expensive as the European option, and that's because the barrier is below the strike price, right? When this barrier option gets knocked out, it's out of the money anyway. And my down and in has a price of $406. And then here I have the up scenario where the strike price is 110, and here I have my up and out with a barrier at 115. You can see this is interesting, to me at least. The up and out is only 13 cents, right? And that's this option is out of the money until the stock price reaches 110 anyway. And then, so we've only got that $5 in there where it's going to end up with intrinsic value, because if it goes above 115, then we get knocked out anyway. So that option deserves to be cheap. And the option over here at 106, the up and in is actually pretty close to the 119, but they total together. And then the other interesting case, I think, is that case of the zero, where we have the barrier of 105 is below the strike price. And you'll notice here that up and out, the up and out barrier option, where the barrier is below the strike over here, is worth 0, right? As it should be. This option will never get knocked out before it reaches any positive intrinsic value. And so the up and in here is worth 119. It's worth the same as a European call. For a similar reason, right? This option doesn't have any value until the stock price reaches 110. So what's the difference? It gets activated at 105. We're still going to be underwater. So that's the special case, I think. And then that describes all of the scenarios and gets us a little bit into the valuation. So if this video is helpful, please subscribe to the channel and you'll get updated with future videos. Thank you.